Well, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Brown People Problems with me, your host, Nikita. And this is a podcast where we chat about topics and experiences that are unique to Brown people and what it means to navigate life while being Brown. So, in today's episode, I'm sitting down with Mrinal Gokhale, who is based in Wisconsin, and she's actually the author of an anthology book on South Asian mental health, which is called Saaya Unveiled. Since its publication, she's also become a speaker and a writing workshop facilitator. Welcome, Mrinal.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. How are you feeling being here today?
I'm feeling pretty good. I think that I've done lots of these podcast interviews. I think this is only like my second or third since the new year, though.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I did check out some of your other podcast episodes, and it sounds like you've become quite a pro at these.
Yep, which I never expected.
Yeah. Well, I did glance at your book, but tell us a little bit more about your book on South Asian mental health. I know it's such a niche, and there's such a need for more South Asian stories in the realm of mental health.
Yeah, so my book was published in May of 2021. It's a collection of 11 true stories, all written in third person, featuring interviews from myself. So kind of journalistically written, and each person that's featured, I help tell their story in regards to, having experienced a mental health related challenge and how they went about navigating that. And topics such as cultural stigma come up, sometimes religion and spirituality come up, trauma, loss, those types of things, academia, typical, I think, mental health related challenge, but from a South Asian lens.
Yeah, well, seems like you kind of covered a lot there with all the different, topics. Tell us a little bit more about what was the mission behind this book, because it sounds like a really cool kind of initiative. Was there something in particular that really inspired you?
Sure. So I never had it in my mind to write a book before. However, I worked as a freelance journalist for 5 years for a Black and Latino-owned paper in my city. And during quarantine, right when it started, when I was on lockdown, I took a free memoir writing class. And then that teacher talked about said, if you want to publish the writings from today, here's some resources, here's some publishing houses, or you can get into the world of self-publishing, such as by Amazon Kindle, which is what I did. And basically, I was like, I think that this would be kind of an interesting thing to take on, since self-publishing can make a book publishing so easy. And then I kind of brainstormed different topics. And then I was like, I was a journalist, I'm into all things human brain related, and especially for mental health in BIPOC communities. And then I think this topic just made the most sense. And I looked up South Asian mental health in Google, and unexpectedly all these organizations came up. So I contacted them, and they put out submission calls for me, and I wrote it from there in a matter of 4 months.
Oh, wow. Yeah. A lot of people tapped into a lot of different skills in the lockdown season, right?
Yep.
Yeah, not that they expected, but I mean, having a background in journalism, I would expect that you're quite good at telling stories.
Yeah, I think that, I guess one challenge I would say that I encountered was that my writing style tends to be just like my speaking style, super concise and kind of dry. And I think that the challenge here, but in a good way, was, being able to tell the stories in a more interesting type of way.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are all real stories of people, and their experiences. That's really cool.
So those organizations put out submission calls to people who have a story to tell, and then I would contact them, and then I would speak to them verbally a few times, and then write their story, have them approve it.
Yeah. I'm curious, did you have difficulty finding people to share their stories on such a big platform like a book? Because I know things are changing, but there's still a lot of us who are really reluctant to talk about mental health.
I would say that for book number one, I had more difficulty finding men than anything else. I think that I reached out to 5 nonprofit organizations around South Asian mental health, and when they put their submission calls, females would come flocking to me in a heartbeat, ready to talk. But there was only two men that I could find after, asking around, like, do you know any men who are willing to talk and this and that? And at first I was like, maybe I should make this a girls only book. But then I was like, no, maybe even if it's just two men and the rest are females, if someone has a son, they could benefit from reading it. But, now that I'm on book number 2, it's actually becoming so much more easier. And I think I can meet my goal of finding half males, half females.
Yeah, that's awesome. What's your second book about?
It's going to be the same thing, an anthology, stories told in third person. Some minor things I'm doing differently are so book 1 is vignette based, and it's like, part 1 and part 2 of each person's story. I'm just going to do one full story for each person now, because some people didn't understand the point of part 1 and part 2. And then I'm going to make sure that there's going to be a lot more diversity, I think, in book number 2. So for example, we're going to be talking LGBT, for example. We're going to have people, South Asians in the LGBT community, telling their stories. And then, like I said, more men, more non-binary folks, more representation of various conditions of mental health that may have not been in book number 1, that kind of stuff. More religions.
Yeah, I love that. That sounds very inclusive.
Yeah.
It sounds like an exciting process. Because the whole purpose of this podcast also is to consolidate all of our unique stories, right, and share them, right? It's just another space to share stories of our communities. And it sounds like you're doing the same thing, but in a book format.
Yep. So I think that, after book number 1, I didn't want to write one for a while because I need lots of time to recuperate, and being that I wrote it in 4 months. And then I've just really been enjoying my journey of public speaking and stuff that I've discovered a love for ever since I wrote it. But then I was like, I kept meeting more people, South Asians with mental health related experiences. And I was like, these stories need to be told too. So, the book's almost 2 years old now. So why not now?
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting, right? How one thing leads to another.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious, have you received any maybe not so fun comments about your work with this? Or on the whole, has your South Asian community in where you live, and I guess like in the States as well, have they been more welcoming of this?
Yes. So I think that So at first I was like, this book would only be well received by second generation South Asians and younger. But then my parents had like their friends and family buy copies and stuff. And I received real good feedback from them too, like saying, I would have never known that, immigrants' children experience these sorts of things. My kids never talked to me about it and this and that. So I think that in that sense, it did promote intergenerational healing. I think that once in a while, I'll get a critique about my writing style, about how I could have said things in a more interesting way, but I do know that fluff writing is a natural challenge for me anyway. So, and I'm trying to work on that a little bit more in book number 2, but if it doesn't happen, then I know that that there's plenty of people that will take my straightforward, dry writing style too. And I think that, maybe I think I had one person, like an elder, kind of express a little bit of discomfort at people in the book speaking negatively about their elders or their parents or family members. I guess I didn't really know what to, they said it something along the lines of the frustration combined with empathy is apparent or something. And it was said in a text, so I couldn't tell the tone that it was said with, but I kind of just replied saying, I try to cover all sides as much as possible. And then they did say, some maybe parents are willing to talk too. So I was like, yeah, in book number 2, I'm going to try to see if anyone has anyone in their family or anyone else that may want to talk in the story. And I did find one person so far.
Yeah. I would imagine you would, despite your best intentions, the type of work that you were doing and I am doing, we're bound to step on people's toes a little bit, right? But something that I kind of like to always say is that this is not a place for us to pass any judgments, right? But it's more just to share our stories and our perspectives.
Yeah, and I think that as a journalist, I've grown accustomed to trying to be as neutral as possible about certain things when it comes to my
Right.
writing. But in this case, it's like, people didn't want to ask their parents to contribute and stuff, and almost half of the contributors in book number one didn't even want their real name used.
Mm.
And I think so. Basically, some patterns that you'll pick up on if you were to read book number one is you will see people expressing frustration at, mom and dad wouldn't let me go to therapy, mom and dad wouldn't let me do meds until it got to a serious life-threatening point or something like that. And I think the repetition of that is what that person was kind of expressing some discomfort at hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's tough, right? That's a tough space to navigate, especially you as being now the sharer of everyone's stories. There's bound to be some, not backlash, but there's bound to be some disagreement and some uncomfortable feelings that come up for a lot of people, like rightfully so. But I think that's maybe part and parcel of this work.
Yeah, and I think that since I'm a second generation, I think hearing those things in a way did offer me a form of therapy because I live in a segregated city, and I think the second most segregated city in the whole US. And I think that growing up, I had an Indian community, but not so much in my school. It was more so in the circle of the family and like the temple and stuff like that. And I feel like I was used to seeing South Asians represented in one way, and that's like under the model minority myth. And I think all my life, I never met a single South Asian that went to therapy that had a mental health related diagnosis unless it was severe. And I think reading this book kind of gave me exposure to people who look like myself that struggle with similar things such as myself or other things, and are as pro therapy, pro mental health advocacy and treatment as I am. And that helped me immensely too. And I think that with the stigma and stuff, I could relate to them in that capacity, and I could empathize with frustrations they would express at elder generations. But at the same time, they did try to express some understanding and empathy on where the stigma might be coming from too. And that kind of helped me open my mind up a little bit too, because I very much experienced the same frustration. And naturally, I'm a person who has difficulty mentally trading spaces with other humans too. So
yeah, it sounds like this experience really normalized a lot of what maybe you had experienced, right? And like you said,
yes.
it provided like a lot more of this like sense of community when we see people share similar stories.
And comfort, and I think gave me a whole new purpose too that I would have never thought I would have found before.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely like a transition, right, from journalism into writing and public speaking. And tell me a little bit more about what types of public speaking engagements you engage in.
So I've done many podcasts such as this one right now. I have done one in-person public speaking event, I think probably because COVID wouldn't have allowed for more. And that was at a college here in the same state that I live in, for APIDA month, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And that college had an organization, like a student club around it, and they hired me in March to talk and to do a workshop around themes in the book that involved journaling and sharing.
Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah. Was there a good turnout for that?
Yeah, so it was a small group, but still, I would say a little under 10, but it was a student organization. So it's not meant to be massive.
Right.
But I think that, as a person who's a natural introvert, it's like, or an ambivert in a sense, I guess I like being around people, but then need to recharge, regroup. And I would notice that initially after doing interviews, podcasts and whatnot, I would get a bit of a headache afterward. And that was one of the first times that I didn't. So I think that those students there were a lot of fun and really fueled my fire too, which was something that I also did not expect.
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said about doing something like this in person right? And that like exchange of energy that happens between people with a shared purpose, that can be very, it can be sort of recharging for a lot of us.
Yeah, I think that I was quite nervous about it too because I'm only used to virtual. So that transition and something new brought about uncertainty for me, and uncertainty makes me nervous and anxious.
Yeah, doesn't it all for all of us?
Yep.
Right. Yeah. So have you, would you say, experienced some stigma in the larger South Asian community as well around mental health? Because I know we all have our own stories, right, of stigma and what it's looked like for all of us.
So I've experienced the stigma of, I've noticed in my circle that in elders that mental health is somewhat swept under the rug, that you care a lot about keeping up appearances, but you'll see that pattern in my book and in daily life anyways. But I think that what stands out to me in my journey is this ideology of seeing mental health and the treatments that come with it as a binary thing, that it's only for if your life is in danger that you should pursue anything, that it's a private matter otherwise to be handled at home. And that's based on the fact that I never did a day of therapy in my life until the age of 20, despite having navigated a lot of social, emotional, and academic struggles growing up.
Yeah, for sure. I think there is this really large narrative, right, of like what happens in the home, like stays in the home, and we don't talk about what's happening in the home to outsiders, which I think is a barrier for so many of us in accessing therapy because it's already such a Eurocentric concept to begin with. And then when it really clashes with some of those internalized beliefs of, oh my gosh, I'm sharing my family stuff with a stranger, that can really get compounded.
Yeah, and I think that additionally, it's this ideology that mental health struggles are seen as a spiritual or religious or a lack of willpower type imbalance as opposed to a medical or brain chemistry based one. And the ideology also that you're weak for not being able to handle it by yourself, or your parents failed you somehow if they can't handle it. And I think the more people I talk to, the more I'm realizing that it has something to do also with immigrants themselves from South Asia did not have therapy back in their countries. They didn't get any therapy when it came to the hardships of coming down here and this and that. And I try to be understanding of that. I do.
Yeah, I think a theme that I've sort of noticed come up in a lot of my podcast episodes is with most guests, we're really kind of identifying how, as a community of brown people outside of South Asia, we are so used to living in survival mode all the time. And, a lot of that just comes from like colonialism trauma, right? Partition trauma, immigration trauma. Yeah, that's very traumatic. And so when we've kind of seen people in our family and maybe our parents and grandparents always function in a survival mode, it's almost like we don't know any different, right? Until we start to do things differently.
Yeah, and I think that also when it comes to sub-communities within South Asian communities, it's important to consider, I say, things like the socioeconomic factors, things like religious factors, because there's diversity within diversity, there's communities within communities. And I think that so many people clump South Asians. They probably don't even call us South Asians or South Asians. They just call us Arabs or brown or Indians, failing to recognize ethnicity, religion, castes, and the fact that different provinces within South Asia each have their own culture in and of themselves. And I think that those things should be taken into consideration when looking at stigma too. And for example, I am Marathi and I'm Indian American. I have two engineer parents, and I was very much already born into entitlement. And I think that part of that may be why, it's not that hard for me to understand that my life is worth more than just survival. And I have no shame in seeking, looking for thriving rather than just surviving too in my life. And but then again, I notice things like, if someone's like I've noticed like Canada, for example, has a lot of working class South Asians compared to the US.
Yeah.
And I do notice that things like having a lower education and stuff does make families and stuff respond a little differently to mental health in terms of maybe thinking that, maybe viewing it as a religious imbalance, for example. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's so much variability, right, in our communities that's affected by a family's socioeconomic status, their own family dynamics, their personal beliefs, their familial values. It is impossible to generalize, right, as a group, that there's so much variability that impacts how our attitudes around mental health are formed, our beliefs are formed. So I think that makes a lot of sense. But, having said that, there are some general trends, I think, that we, see in terms of like the kind of media that's more prominent, I think, in our communities and
collectivism too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So it sounds like you've really been this like advocate for thriving instead of just, surviving. I love that.
Yeah. And I guess it is important to highlight too that I have the privilege to seek that out in my life.
Yeah.
In comparison to some.
Absolutely. I think I was chatting with someone in my last episode about this too, that we kind of, as children of immigrants and as second generation, we kind of have to take a step back and really acknowledge like our privilege as well, right? That partly thanks to all the sacrifices made by our parents or their parents' generation, we are in a position of vast privilege where we don't have to be in survival mode anymore, and we can access the resources that are available to us. We do have the financial means or maybe the emotional bandwidth to think about a lot of this stuff that maybe a typical, working class immigrant parent didn't.
Right. Or in some cases, such as within my family, highly educated immigrant parents. But I feel like, regardless, an immigrant period is kind of in survival mode all the time, I think. And then when you think, I've had it explained to me that in South Asian countries, like economically speaking, it's like I was taught when I was young, the reason that so many South Asians work in medicine and STEM is because that's how you prove yourself worthy for a green card. And that's kind of the income you need in a South Asian country to even just survive. And that mindset seems to transfer that they need that type of income even in America to even just survive.
And I know, and I don't know if this has been your personal experience, but what I'm sort of generally seeing is that there has been quite a bit of progress in our communities, right? I think there's now this like sense of like openness around being like receptive to this whole idea of mental health and demystifying therapy, and there's a lot of openness there. But I'm wondering if there's some specific barriers that come to mind for you that you think are continuing to perpetuate the stigma.
I agree with you that things are changing now, and I know because of the world of social media, because of the pandemic, I think it forced people to really be more open about these things and to seek out support services and stuff like that. And also India and South Asia is slowly starting to change in their value system and stuff. But if I had to guess about, what may continue to perpetuate, I would say that statement you made about colonialism. I think that there's a reason in my book so many people felt so strongly about wanting to work with a South Asian provider. And that's because you don't have to explain yourself away in terms of why your family acts the way they do what they do, think the way they do. I think that maybe if there was more providers that were fluent in South Asian languages too, that could find a way to reach the elder generation of immigrants as well, that would be a better step, a nicer step forward as well, in order to, again, the intergenerational healing thing. So it's not just us younger generations that are doing it all.
Right, intergenerational. Absolutely. There's a couple of nonprofits in the Toronto, in the greater Toronto area that are going into temples and going into gurdwaras and setting up these like information booths, which is really just, like, I'm here to talk about mental health. Any questions that you have for me, I can answer them for you. And a local organization actually found that they did this experiment. And I found it really helpful when they just went and they set up a booth in a gurdwara, and they were, there for 8 hours, and they said, any questions, we're not going to judge. Whatever you're wondering about, we're here to answer. And that opened up a lot of conversation to the point where they almost had to make it like a weekly thing that they were showing up.
So it almost sounds like a support group.
Yeah, a support group, but also just, this a place for them to ask questions, right? Because I think maybe the younger generation, for us, it's very easy for us to maybe like Google, or we have a lot of different media exposure, but for the older generation, they may not even know where to start. And they're also, I think, maybe more receptive to the information when it's coming from someone who looks like them and is part of maybe their generation.
And can also speak their probably language. Not a therapy provider.
Exactly. Just another layperson.
Yeah, and I think that I was told that, in South Asia, despite therapy being available, the ideology of seeking one is a huge no-no to a lot of people. And I think that my cousin of mine brought up a good point when she said that, religion and spirituality helps you to connect with camaraderie, and which can promote healing. And I think that it can connect you to, which, I'm not opposed to that. I'm not saying anything is wrong with it, but I think that, maybe if spiritual leaders and religious leaders came together with healthcare providers, then maybe we could kind of promote the ideology that you can totally have both in your life, and where things like religion and spirituality or relying on a family unit may not be enough.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say that, I'm thinking about a local mosque in the greater Toronto area, and they started like a healthcare panel. So where I believe it's once a month, they have different healthcare professionals that sit down and they do this like meet and greet at the mosque. There's a therapist in there, there's a medical doctor in there, there's like a nutritionist, naturopath, all these different disciplines that kind of come together. And again, same idea that people can sign up for this like hour-long or half an hour-long meet and greet. And that's a space for them to ask questions, because these places of worship, right, they have been so important for our communities. These are places of gathering. These are places that offer like a community-like feel. So if we want to create that intergenerational change, I think a lot of it has to be, you kind of have to go to the communities instead of waiting for the community to come to you.
Yeah, and I think that doing so will, I think the message that needs to be promoted is that when it comes to Western versus holistic versus religious, none of them are better or inferior to the other, and what you need in your life is not a one-size-fits-all for every individual.
Yeah, that a more comprehensive lens, right, that is more holistic.
Yeah, and I think getting away from the whole one flew over the cuckoo's nest type image for the elder generations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, another barrier that I always kind of noticed was just the type of media that existed in terms of like movies. And I think a lot of that is still there, but I am noticing this huge change in the types of movies that are now coming out of South Asia. They tend to be a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more woke, and they kind of target a lot of these different challenging topics. And I think that has a lot of mass impact as well.
Yeah, I think that things like, Never Have I Ever, I think that's a bit controversial for a lot of people. I think that a lot of people love that they talk about things like grief, and they show a brown child going into counseling and this and that. I know it's drawn some critique for some stereotypy type stuff. However, I guess that it's still a step up in terms of representation beyond just Mindy Kaling.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And then, you have people like Lily Singh and all these people really kind of just making themselves known. So I think
Yeah.
when I was growing up, I don't know about you, when I was growing up, like 20, 30 years ago, there wasn't that visual representation. Like I was just not used to seeing people who looked like me in the Western media. Like I can't even imagine what it must have been like for me to grow up and watching a show like Never Have I Ever at that time. But was that also sort of like your experience?
Yes. Well, so I grew up in a segregated city, and on top of not
Yeah.
having a lot of exposure to Indian children within the school systems, yes, I had only seen, things like Apu from The Simpsons, or
Yes.
the racist portrayals of South Asians in like Seinfeld. And
Mm.
I think that I myself was duped into seeing one image of South Asians, and that was, this image of people who work in STEM, middle class or higher, who are high achieving and flawless and live life in this linear fashion that everyone should model, or, a gas station entrepreneur, taxi driver.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because I understand that there's a lot of variability, right, in like the Indo-Canadian culture and the Indian American, culture as well. The demographics can be a little bit different. And just generally the Canadian culture is different than the American culture. And like you said, you being in like a segregated city too, that must have really maybe felt isolating at some points as well.
I think that I didn't think much of it when I was little.
Mm.
I just thought that it's, a norm or whatever. It was funny because,
Mm.
in my school, I could count on one hand the number of Indian children, but then it's like, my family would make connections at the temple and stuff. And when I was little, we would all go to get-togethers with them. And so it was like in under one roof, it was all South Asian Indian folks. And then in the
Yeah.
school systems and out in the community, it was
Yeah.
predominantly white and middle class or higher.
Yeah. Yeah. That must have been like a huge shift to navigate.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think that the book kind of exposed me to Indian or South Asian folks from various countries and various cities, states, and did open up my eyes to just how much diversity
Yeah.
there is in diversity that I didn't even know of.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm really an advocate for a lot of BIPOC authors. I'm an avid reader, and part of also what I do on my YouTube channel is just share a lot of like BIPOC reads, and it's just so refreshing now to go to Chapters, which is like our Barnes and Nobles, and see not just people of color authors, but to see South Asian names on like the bestseller lists, or like the book talk like trending, and it's just so gratifying to see that.
Yeah, I think that when I wrote my book in May of 2021, I think that really, once I started, getting into the world of building my gram via Instagram and social media, that is just through hashtags, I discovered that I was overwhelmed. Like I thought that I would be one of the only people doing this, and that it would be so rare and I wouldn't be able to reach a lot of people, to all of a sudden seeing a giant community of authors, of creators, of counselors, of healthcare providers, of podcasters that look like us.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And there's so many, you've got yourself, you've got Vaishnavi Patel, who's just come out with Keke, which is huge. You've got people like Balikar Jaswal, you've got Chitra Banerjee from Houston. There's just so many brown women telling stories of brown women,
Yeah.
whether these are mythological or, fictional or real women.
Yeah. Like on the Brown Girl Bookshelf account, the Daisy Book Auntie account is flooding with a new one every day, both for kids and adults.
Yeah, exactly. No, there's just so much more available right now, and that's really awesome to see.
And I've really made it, I've kind of developed a liking towards supporting small businesses when it comes to gift giving to people. And I think within my family circle, I've made it my thing to always support a South Asian business now when gifting something to them. And a lot of them have been super impressed and intrigued by the stuff that I bought for them or for their kids. And because of that, and it's all through Instagram that I'm discovering these products and these business owners.
Yeah, I love that. I've done something similar too in the last little while. I've made it a point for any friends or family members' birthday. I've decided to gift them a book by a South Asian author.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, and specifically for my female friends, been really gifting them this book called like Girls That Invest. So I think these changes, they can seem really small and they can seem really mundane, but I think it's also up to us to amplify voices, right, that exist.
Right. And I think that one of my closest cousins who's raising a toddler right now, these are they have been quite intrigued by the stuff I've been getting them and for the little girl,
Yeah.
because I think their struggle or they're kind of at a loss as to where to start when it comes to raising a child and balancing cultures, being that they're in my age group and they grew up in a time in India where it was starting to change a lot and become a bit more westernized than a bit 20 years ago. But then not, and then they moved to America as young adults and then birthed a child there. And
Yeah.
I think that they've been, when I've bought them stuff, they were like, oh, we never thought of this as a way to teach culture and this and that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So in addition to gift giving and conscious gift giving, intentional gift giving, what are some tips that you would like to give to our listeners on how they can be curious, maybe, and challenge the mental health stigma, not just within like their communities, but also within themselves?
Within yourself, I would say try to ask yourself, what mental health really means to you. Learn the difference between mental health and illness, because a lot of people use those terms interchangeably.
Right.
Try to see if you see mental health as something very binary and how that can be challenged. Try to ask yourself things about what does surviving mean to you versus what does thriving mean to you. Ask yourself, what does it mean to you if you were to seek outside help, if you're needing help in either of those areas, and what that means and why you feel that way. Try to ask yourself, what am I used to seeing? What has the world taught me what mental health is in terms of things like mass media influences and family members, and what nuances have I not necessarily explored?
I love that. Those are very thought-provoking. And is there anything in specific? No, that's great. And is there anything in specific you would want them to think about when it comes to challenging the stigma in their circles?
In their circles, I would say that they should seek out tools such as my book or someone else's book that are a bit better at. So with my book, I was very intentional about providing studies and clinical definitions of things, because I understood that people in the older generations may need some things broken down a bit more.
Right.
So it's like, I think that within your own circles, you should be seeking out ways to kind of help, I guess, meet people where they're at, so to speak, in a sense.
Right.
And being able to open grounds for these difficult conversations, whether it's, by yourselves or by hiring a professional to help you do that. One with cultural sensitivity and knowledge.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's important. Yeah, I think meeting people where they are, and also meeting yourself, right, where you are, because I think also as children of immigrants in our generation, maybe some of us feel like they have to carry this burden now of changing everything and changing the culture. And that can be really exhausting. And we don't have to shoulder that burden all the time.
Yeah, and I think I felt the same way growing up, being that when it comes to immediate family, it's like me and my brother were the only ones born and raised in America out of the 8 or 10 first cousins we have.
Wow, yeah.
And then it's like I'm the only female on the first cousins on my mother's side, for example. I'm one of the only ones that chose to study a non-STEM field. I'm the only one that became a journalist. I'm the only one that wrote a book. And then on top of that, living in a segregated city, I think that writing this book was a form of therapy in itself for me, for giving me that camaraderie and making me feel not special, but in a good way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I get that. I get that. No, it's really lovely. And hopefully, as our listeners kind of walk away from this, it gives them something to kind of chew on a little bit as well.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Yeah. Well, this is really lovely talking to you today. Thanks so much for coming on here, Mrinal. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. And for anyone who would like to get in touch with Mrinal, check out her book. I will leave all of her links down below. Um, and I really look forward to now hearing more about your second book.
Yeah, it's in the works right now. I wanted it to be published by summertime. I'm on the edge whether that'll happen or not, but I'm forgiving myself for that because we're no longer in lockdown mode and I have other things to do.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You've got now a life to live as well. So that makes sense. Well, congratulations on all the awesome work that you're doing.
Thank you. You too.
Yeah, perfect. Stay tuned for our disclaimer. The guest and the host at Brown People Problems do not offer individualized therapeutic or medical advice, and our conversations should not be interpreted as such. This podcast is not a replacement for therapy. This podcast exists for educational purposes only. Please consider your circumstances and engage with the content mindfully.